Grenfell Tower rose quietly above the rooftops of West London. Just off the busy streets of North Kensington, the concrete tower stood tall, 24 floors high, surrounded by low-rise blocks, trees, and narrow footpaths. For decades, it had been part of the city's skyline, barely noticed by those who didn't live there. But for the hundreds who did, it was everything. Grenfell wasn't just a building. It was a home. Built in the early 1970s, Grenfell was designed as part of a post-war movement to provide working-class families with modern, affordable housing. Public housing, known in the UK as social housing, was seen at the time as a public good, not a last resort. The idea was simple: give families clean, spacious flats with heating, indoor bathrooms, and views of the city. By 2017, the tower had gone through changes. Some residents had lived there for decades. Others had arrived only recently: refugees, young families, the elderly. The building had grown more diverse with every passing year. Grenfell Tower held people from dozens of nationalities: British, Moroccan, Eritrean, Filipino, Syrian, Ghanaian, and more. It was a vertical village, filled with life on every floor. The building had 129 apartments across 20 residential floors, with 4 more for maintenance, access, and utilities. Each flat had a small kitchen, a living room, and bedrooms tucked behind narrow hallways. Some units had balconies. Most faced out over London, with views stretching from the parks of Kensington to the towers of Canary Wharf. Inside, life followed its own rhythm. Mornings started early, school bags packed, lifts filling up, buses waiting just outside. In the evenings, you could hear laughter in the stairwells, the sounds of different languages blending as neighbors greeted each other. Children ran between flats. Doors stayed open. Families shared food, advice, stories. For many, Grenfell was affordable in a city where housing had become nearly impossible to manage. London's housing crisis had pushed many working-class families to the edge. But Grenfell, despite its wear and aging design, still offered shelter, stability, and something more: community. The people who lived there looked out for one another. When someone fell sick, neighbors checked in. When a new family moved in, the others brought food and offered help. There were WhatsApp groups for every floor, sharing everything from babysitting tips to lost keys to warnings when the lifts broke down. And they did break down. Often, the building had problems: leaks, peeling paint, a heating system that sometimes failed in the winter. Residents had complained for years. Letters were written, emails sent, meetings held with the building's management, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, the group responsible for managing Grenfell and other council housing in the borough. Still, life continued. In 2016, Grenfell Tower underwent a major refurbishment. The project was supposed to modernize the building, replace windows, update pipes, and improve insulation. But the biggest change came on the outside. A new exterior cladding was installed: sleek, aluminum panels designed to improve energy efficiency and make the building look more modern. It gave the tower a new face, shiny and smooth, compared to the raw concrete it had worn for decades. But few residents were impressed. The refurbishment had been disruptive. Water was shut off at times. Work crews came and went without clear notice. Some residents felt ignored, their concerns brushed aside. Many didn't trust that the materials being used were safe. Fire safety was a recurring topic in community meetings. People asked about evacuation plans, fire alarms, sprinkler systems. The answers they got were vague, inconsistent, sometimes dismissive. Despite all that, life went on. In Flat 205, a couple raised 2 small children. In Flat 91, a Syrian refugee family had finally found peace after escaping war. On the 21st floor, a 12-year-old boy practiced piano while his grandmother made tea in the kitchen. These were real lives, ordinary, quiet, full of joy and struggle like anywhere else. In the lobby, a notice board held community news: a local food drive, English classes, job fairs. On weekends, some residents volunteered at nearby churches and mosques. Others cooked for elderly neighbors or helped out at schools down the road. From the outside, Grenfell may have looked like any other tower block. but inside it was alive with stories. Some residents worried about being forgotten, about being invisible in one of London's wealthiest boroughs. Just minutes away were multi-million-pound townhouses, embassies, and private schools. Yet inside Grenfell, people sometimes had to boil water to wash dishes because the hot water wasn't working. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just economic, it was physical. Visible. Grenfell stood as a symbol of that divide. Still, residents believed things could improve. They hoped someone was listening, that concerns raised would lead to changes, that safety warnings would matter, that the place they called home would be cared for, respected. No one could have imagined what was coming. In a city as big and fast-moving as London, it's easy for voices to get lost, especially when they come from the top floors of an aging tower block. But the residents of Grenfell Tower weren't silent. Far from it, they spoke up. They wrote letters, attended meetings, and organized. Over and over again, they tried to raise alarms. And over again, they were dismissed. For years before the fire, residents had warned of serious safety problems inside the building. Some were small, broken lights in stairwells, doors that didn't close properly, alarms that failed to sound. Others were more serious, including blocked exits and faulty wiring. The building had one staircase. One narrow, smoke-prone staircase serving all 24 floors. There were no sprinklers, no central fire alarm system. Emergency lighting was limited. Most residents didn't know of a full evacuation plan because there wasn't one. The guidance was to stay put, a policy rooted in older fire protocols that assumed fires would be contained to individual flats. But the residents knew Grenfell wasn't like other buildings. After the refurbishment in 2016, several raised concerns about the new cladding and how it had been installed. The aluminum panels, added to improve insulation and appearance, came with polyethylene-filled cores, a flammable material used to cut costs. Few residents knew the full details of the materials. Fewer still had any say in the choices made. But something felt wrong. A residents' group, the Grenfell Action Group, began posting detailed warnings online. Their blog entries were firm, emotional, and precise. They accused the managing organization, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, or KCTMO, of neglect, mismanagement, and indifference. They warned that a major fire was not only possible, it was inevitable. One post from 2016 read plainly, "It is our belief that a serious fire in a tower block is the most likely reason that those who wield power at the KCTMO will be found out and brought to justice." That post would later be read aloud in Parliament. But at the time, it went unnoticed by those in charge. The relationship between residents and building managers had grown tense. Many felt that decisions were made without consultation, that when they tried to speak, they were spoken over. When they asked questions, they received bureaucratic replies or none at all. At one meeting, residents questioned the fire safety of the new external insulation. They were told not to worry. When they asked about evacuation procedures, they were reminded of the stay-put policy. When they asked if fire doors and smoke ventilation systems had been tested, the answers were vague, often followed by silence. And yet, life continued. Kids went to school. Parents headed to work. Elderly residents sat on benches at the base of the tower, watching traffic pass. People gathered outside the local mosque after prayers. Others met at the community center nearby. Some worked in hospitals, schools, taxis, markets. They were cleaners, students, chefs, shop assistants, electricians. And many trusted that if something serious were ever to happen, someone would act. In 2017, just months before the fire, inspections had taken place. There were no urgent findings that led to direct action. Fire risk assessments were carried out, but their full contents weren't shared widely. Few, if any, residents understood the full implications. There was a sense that everything would carry on, that buildings like Grenfell, though imperfect, had always stood and always would. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The wealth divide in Kensington and Chelsea was sharp. This was one of the richest boroughs in Europe. Yet inside Grenfell, basic safety systems were outdated, and complaints were routinely ignored. Residents sometimes felt like second-class citizens in their own city, unheard and unseen. Even during the refurbishment, corners had been cut. The original plans had called for higher-spec materials, but cost-saving measures led to the use of cheaper cladding and insulation. Technical reports had noted fire safety limitations, but they didn't lead to major changes. For the residents, it was difficult to know what had been approved and what hadn't. The decisions were made behind closed doors. Technical language filled the paperwork. But what mattered was this: the building now had an outer layer that could burn. And no one told the residents. They didn't know how the new materials would behave in a fire. They didn't know that fire could jump from floor to floor within minutes. They didn't know that the cavity between the cladding and the building's wall could create a deadly chimney effect. They were never told. As summer approached, the tower looked clean and modern from the outside. The cladding reflected the sky. The windows had been replaced. The paint was fresh, but inside the worries remained. In the weeks before the fire, several residents again raised concerns. One reported electrical surges. Another spoke of a strange smell on the fourth floor. Small fires had broken out in other blocks on the estate. None had spread. Each time, residents had stayed put as advised. Each time, the fire had been controlled. No one expected what would happen next. Tuesday, June 13, 2017, had been warm. Summer was settling in over London. The sun set late, and by the time it dipped below the skyline, Grenfell Tower glowed softly in the fading light. From the higher floors, residents could see the city stretching out for miles: rooftops, cranes, headlights. Inside the building, life was winding down. Families were finishing dinner. Children were brushing their teeth. Some adults were watching television. Others were scrolling through their phones or chatting with neighbors online. It was a normal night. Shortly after midnight, silence took over the tower. Most lights were off. The elevators had slowed to a stop. But in flat 16 on the fourth floor, one apartment was still lit. A small kitchen. A quiet space. Nothing unusual. Just after 12:50 a.m., a small fire started in that flat. The exact cause was a malfunction in a fridge freezer, a model that had been in the home for years. It caught quietly at first, sending smoke into the kitchen. The resident inside, a man who had lived there for a long time, noticed it quickly and called emergency services at 12:54 a.m. He warned them of a kitchen fire and tried to fight it himself. But within minutes, the flames had grown beyond what he could handle. London Fire Brigade dispatched engines. The first arrived at 12:59 a.m. Crews entered the building, moved swiftly up to the fourth floor, and began to attack the fire inside flat 16. At that point, it still seemed manageable. Firefighters wore breathing equipment and used hoses to contain the flames. The structure of the flat helped. Reinforced concrete and compartmentalization were meant to prevent the spread of fire from unit to unit. But what happened next was not expected. As the heat intensified, it breached the window. Flames licked outside, reaching the new exterior cladding that had been installed during the 2016 refurbishment. At 1:08 a.m., firefighters inside the building radioed that fire had spread outside the flat. They didn't yet understand what they were seeing, but outside, witnesses were already watching in horror. Flames were climbing the side of the tower, not drifting, but racing. Vertical strips of fire, surging upward. The new cladding, aluminum composite panels with a polyethylene core, was catching fire rapidly. Beneath the panels, a narrow gap between the cladding and the building's wall allowed flames to rise like air through a chimney. The insulation behind the panels ignited too, fueling the fire further. By 1:15 a.m., fire had reached the top floors. Residents started waking up. Some had already smelled smoke. Others were alerted by phone calls from friends, family, neighbors. On the lower floors, some people had evacuated early. But many on the upper levels were still asleep, unaware of what was happening outside their windows. At 1:26 a.m., a full evacuation was still not underway. The stay-put policy remained in place. This was standard procedure in high-rise fires in the UK. The idea was that flats were built to contain fire for at least 30 minutes. Firefighters could deal with the problem while residents remained safe in their homes. In most cases, this policy had worked. But this night wasn't like most cases. The fire wasn't staying in one place. It was moving with frightening speed, not through flats, but around the outside of the building. By the time some residents opened their front doors, the hallways were filled with thick black smoke. Emergency lights were dim. The staircase was already compromised. People started calling emergency services from inside their homes. Dozens of calls flooded the control center, many from upper floors. The panic in their voices grew as they described smoke coming in through windows, under doors, through vents. Children cried in the background. People begged for help. At 1:38 a.m., the first call came from the 23rd floor. The fire was now above that level. Smoke and flames had wrapped around the entire building. The cladding acted like fuel. Pieces of it broke off, raining fire down to the ground. Residents still inside the building were trapped in a deadly circle, unable to see, unable to breathe, and unable to escape. Some tried to run down the stairs. They fought through heat and smoke. Others returned to their flats, blocking doors with towels, hoping rescue would come. Firefighters were inside the building, moving floor by floor, trying to reach those calling for help. But visibility was near zero. The heat was extreme. Radios crackled with confusion and chaos. Crews had to make impossible choices. Who to rescue first, where to go next, which calls could be reached and which could not. By 2 a.m., hundreds of people had gathered outside, watching as the tower burned. Friends, family, neighbors, many knew someone inside. Some had tried calling, texting, shouting up toward the windows. Others watched in silence, unable to look away. People in surrounding buildings recorded video, live-streamed, screamed for help. Social media lit up with desperate messages. Get out if you can. Call your family. The fire is on every side. Inside the tower, the conditions worsened by the minute. Entire flats filled with smoke. Some residents were able to make it out, mostly from the lower floors. Others became trapped as their only exit became impassable. In some flats, families huddled together. They moved to bathrooms. They opened windows for air despite the choking smoke outside. Some tied clothing into makeshift ropes. A few even tried to lower children from windows, anything to escape the unbearable heat. One resident on the 22nd floor made a final call to relatives. Another texted a friend to say goodbye. A woman on the 19th floor filmed her surroundings for her children, in case she didn't make it out. Still, many waited for help, believing someone would come, that the fire could not possibly consume the whole building, that the rescue would reach them. But the fire continued. By 3 a.m., the tower was engulfed. Over 200 firefighters were on scene, more than 40 engines. They attacked from every angle. Hoses from the ground, ladders from above, water from nearby buildings. But the heat and height made it nearly impossible. Calls to emergency services never stopped. Each one documented a life hanging in the balance. And still, many inside the tower remained where they had been told to stay, until it was too late to move. By 3:30 a.m., the tower had become a skeleton of flames. From the ground, it no longer looked like a place where people lived. The windows flickered like candles. Black smoke poured from every side. Flames curled in and out of each floor, folding around the building like a sheet of fire. But inside, hundreds of people were still alive. Some were on the move, crawling through dark corridors or clutching stair rails as they descended in thick smoke. Others had sealed themselves in rooms, opening taps to soak towels, praying the water would hold off the heat. Many were on their phones, trying to reach family, the fire brigade, anyone who could help. Calls to 999 were constant. Over the course of the night, more than 600 emergency calls came from inside the tower. Operators stayed on the line as long as they could. Some spoke with residents for more than an hour, listening as the air ran out. Every voice told a different story. On the 23rd floor, a woman and her children waited in a small bathroom, passing wet cloths between them. She spoke softly to keep them calm, even as the smoke crept through the vents. On the 21st floor, a man in his 60s stood at the window, holding a flashlight. Neighbors had evacuated earlier, but he stayed behind to help his disabled wife. Now they were trapped. He used the light to signal rescuers in the darkness. On the 18th floor, a family of 5 moved from room to room, trying to find air. The father made a call to his brother, whispering that the hallway was on fire. He said they would try to make it to the stairwell, but he wasn't sure they could. One young boy on the 14th floor spoke to an operator. He was alone. His parents weren't home. He didn't know what to do. The call lasted 18 minutes before the line went quiet. Each call became a record, a final moment, a message to the outside world. Firefighters continued to climb, but progress was painfully slow. The building had only one stairwell, and it was filled with smoke and falling debris. Many wore breathing apparatus, but even that gave them only a limited window before they had to retreat. Inside the control vehicles, commanders tracked calls coming from specific flats. They tried to prioritize rescues, sending teams where the need seemed most urgent. But with every floor burning, every call became urgent. Lives were being lost faster than help could reach them. There was no central alarm system inside Grenfell. No sprinklers. No floor-by-floor communications. Firefighters had to rely on hand-drawn building plans and shouted directions. Radios cut out. Visibility was almost zero. Still, some made it out. On the 10th floor, a pregnant woman and her husband found their way to the stairs. They covered their faces and ran down through the smoke. They made it to the ground floor just before the stairwell collapsed behind them. On the 5th floor, an elderly woman was carried out by 2 firefighters. She had lost consciousness but was revived by medics on the scene. She later said she never expected to survive. But for most people above the 15th floor, escape became nearly impossible. By 4 a.m., fire had penetrated flats on every side of the tower. Whole floors were glowing red from the inside out. Cladding panels exploded in the heat. Debris fell onto cars below, setting them alight. The air was thick with ash. Outside, the streets were packed. Hundreds of residents from the Lancaster West estate had evacuated. People stood with blankets over their shoulders, children in their arms, watching the building burn. Some tried to help. Others cried. Many recognized the windows where their friends had lived. Calls continued into the early morning. One woman on the 20th floor begged the operator to tell her when the firefighters would arrive. She had been told to stay put earlier. Now the heat was unbearable, and her windows were glowing orange. The operator could only say that crews were on their way, that help was coming. But it wasn't coming fast enough. Inside the tower, the conditions turned deadly. Smoke was no longer just thick, it was toxic. Made from burning plastics, insulation, wiring, and furniture, it filled the lungs and blocked every exit. The temperature in some flats reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Children were found huddled beneath blankets, faces pressed to the floor in search of air. Adults tied shirts around their mouths. Some wrapped themselves in wet curtains. Others tried to escape through windows, but the height made that impossible. At one point, a baby was thrown from a window. Witnesses say the child was caught by someone below. But stories blurred. Facts were hard to confirm. In the smoke and noise, even time seemed to collapse. Inside the fire brigade, the pressure was overwhelming. Crews rotated in and out, drenched in sweat and soot. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others refused to leave until they'd pulled at least one more person out. It wasn't enough. By 5 a.m., more than 2/3 of the building had been consumed. The top floors were burning from the inside out. No one had made it down from the 23rd floor. The stairwell was impassable. The lifts were out of service. Windows were now the only connection to the world outside, and even those had begun to crack and fall. One firefighter later described the feeling of being inside the tower as walking through hell. Another said he could hear alarms and people screaming, but couldn't see anything past his own hand. Outside, family members began reading names out loud. Some had been on the phone with loved ones moments earlier. Others were searching hospitals, asking if their relatives had made it out. A few tried to run toward the building before being held back. The sun began to rise. Smoke curled into the sky, forming a dark pillar above West London. From miles away, the tower was visible, a black silhouette, broken and burning. Inside, some residents were still alive, but the hope of rescue was fading. The fire at Grenfell Tower had been burning for nearly 6 hours when the sun came up over London. It was now the morning of Wednesday, June 14, 2017. By that time, the top floors of the tower had already been destroyed. Windows were gone, steel frames bent and broken. The cladding had peeled away in long black strips. The smoke was still thick, rising high into the sky and visible across the city. Emergency services were still working, but the tone had shifted. In the earliest hours, firefighters had operated with urgency. The goal was rescue. Reach as many people as possible. Contain the fire. Maintain control. But now, around 6 a.m., the mood turned. There were still people inside, but access was nearly impossible. The stairwell was compromised. Flames had burned through load-bearing walls. Floors had begun to collapse. Rescuers had to be pulled back from certain areas. The risk of structural failure was too high. From the outside, the building looked hollowed out, a dark, skeletal frame still breathing smoke. The fire wasn't fully out. It wouldn't be for hours, but the most intense part of the blaze had passed. Now came something worse: the stillness. On the 23rd floor, there were no more lights flashing, no more phone calls, no movement at the windows. It was the same on the 22nd and the 21st, and so on. The upper half of the building had fallen silent. Many of those who had stayed in their flats, following the stay-put advice, had not made it. Some had stayed because they were told to. Others had stayed because they were too high up to make it down through the smoke. Some were elderly. Others had disabilities. Some simply ran out of time. On the lower floors, there were survivors, but even there, the toll was rising. People who had been pulled from smoke-filled stairwells were collapsing on the pavement, gasping for air. Some were rushed to hospital. Others needed emergency treatment right there on the street. Over 70 people were hospitalized, many with severe burns or smoke inhalation. Dozens were in critical condition. The streets around Grenfell were filled with people. Survivors wrapped in foil blankets, families searching for loved ones, neighbors bringing bottles of water, food, clothing. Volunteers from the local mosque and church arrived to help. So did local doctors and nurses. At 7 a.m., the first live TV news broadcasts began. Images of the burning tower spread across screens across the country. Viewers watched in disbelief as the building, still smoldering, stood as a blackened ruin. Charred balconies, gaping holes, twisted scaffolding. And behind all that, the knowledge that people had died inside. Many people. Official numbers weren't available yet. The fire was still active. Authorities couldn't say who had escaped and who hadn't. But those who had been there through the night already understood. This wasn't a small incident. This wasn't a routine fire. This was a disaster. By 8 a.m., survivors who had escaped began sharing their stories. One woman described crawling through the stairwell for 17 floors, unable to see or breathe. Another man talked about carrying his mother on his back. A teenage boy had escaped from the 15th floor with his younger brother, passing by unconscious bodies on the stairs. A woman from the 19th floor said she waited for over an hour for firefighters to reach her flat. She survived, but the rest of her family did not. The stories were raw, confused, but consistent. Smoke everywhere, no alarms, no sprinklers, and almost no warning that the fire had spread so far. People began asking questions. Why was there only one staircase? Why did the building go up in flames so fast? Why had residents been told to stay inside? And most of all, how could this happen in one of the wealthiest cities in the world? At 9:30 a.m., the Prime Minister was informed of the full scale of the event. Local council officials were already under pressure. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, responsible for the area, had not yet provided public statements. Survivors were being taken to temporary shelters in nearby churches and schools, but coordination was lacking. Community leaders stepped in. Volunteers organized supplies, arranged temporary housing, created lists of missing persons. Local residents, many of whom had spent the night on the street, refused to go home. They stayed to help, to bear witness. As the fire was brought under control, firefighters entered the lower floors to begin searching for survivors and eventually victims. They knew what they would find. Inside, the building was unrecognizable. Burned staircases, collapsed ceilings, furniture reduced to ash. Entire flats melted into one another. There were no lights, no power, no sound but the crunch of broken debris beneath their boots. Rescue gave way to recovery. The London Fire Brigade would later describe it as one of the most difficult operations in its history. Crews worked around the clock in rotations. Many suffered from physical and emotional exhaustion. Some needed psychological support afterward. And still outside, the crowd grew. People held up posters with faces of missing loved ones. "Have you seen?" written in bold across the top. Many of the names belonged to children, families, elderly couples, students. At a nearby wall, people began writing messages. "Rest in peace. Gone but not forgotten. Justice for Grenfell." The fire was nearly out, but the pain was only just beginning. By the time night fell again on June 14th, the fire at Grenfell Tower had been extinguished. But the smoke still hung in the air, clinging to clothes, settling into the streets, drifting between the rows of council flats that surrounded the ruin. The building stood like a burned monument, a 24-story blackened shell. Windows blown out, walls scorched and broken. From a distance, it looked empty. But everyone on the ground knew the truth. Dozens of people were still inside. They just hadn't been recovered yet. The streets were packed. Residents from across London had come to help. Some brought blankets. Others brought food. Some came just to stand in silence, to bear witness. It was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become national. But from the authorities, there was silence. Local government figures were mostly absent from the scene. So was the building's management body, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, known as KCTMO. They had overseen Grenfell Tower. But now, when people needed answers, no one from their offices appeared in person. People were furious. In the early hours, survivors had been sent to nearby churches and sports halls. Some had no shoes. Some had left with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Volunteers stepped in to help. They organized donations, clothes, toiletries, SIM cards, nappies, strollers, bedding. Within hours, the tables overflowed. But coordination from official sources was missing. The council failed to publish accurate information. There was no central register of the missing. Some families searched hospitals. Others called helplines that went unanswered. For survivors, there was no clarity on where they were meant to go, or how they'd be supported. And still, no one could say how many people had died. In press briefings, officials offered cautious estimates. At first, they said 6 dead, then 12. But the crowd outside Grenfell knew it was more. Much more. They had watched the windows. They had listened to the screaming. They had held the hands of people who escaped alone, their families gone. That night, a young man named Mohammed walked the length of the cordon holding a photo of his missing parents. He had been calling their mobile phones for hours. No answer. Their flat was on the 23rd floor. Another woman, wrapped in a scarf, sobbed against a police barricade. Her niece had last called at 3:50 a.m., saying the smoke was in the room. No one had heard from her since. People didn't need numbers. They could feel the loss. By June 15th, protests had begun. Small groups gathered in front of Kensington Town Hall. They carried signs. "We demand justice. We are your residents, not your inconvenience. Where are the missing?" There was anger, but also a deep sense of betrayal. Not just over the fire, but everything that came before it. Years of warnings ignored. Concerns brushed off. Meetings dismissed. The Grenfell Action Group, which had spent years raising fire safety concerns, posted a grim message. All our warnings fell on deaf ears. Now we are left with the consequences. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, made a brief visit to the scene. She spoke with fire chiefs but did not meet survivors or residents. The decision sparked immediate backlash. To many, it reinforced what they already believed, that those in power didn't want to face the people directly affected. By contrast, the local community showed up in full force. The Almanar Muslim Cultural Heritage Center, just around the corner, opened its doors 24/7. The local church set up sleeping areas. Neighborhood kitchens offered hot food. Social workers, legal advisors, and therapists arrived without being asked. None of it had been coordinated by the government. It came from the people. In the media, the story turned quickly. Coverage shifted from the fire itself to what allowed it to happen. Reporters asked about the cladding, about the building's fire safety record, about why residents weren't evacuated, about why the alarms didn't sound. Experts began weighing in. Fire engineers pointed out the rapid spread of flames. Architects criticized the building's lack of second exits. Survivors gave testimony to what they had seen. No sprinklers, no alarms, no guidance once the fire began. They described being told to stay put, even as the building burned above and below them. And through it all, the death toll slowly climbed. On June 16th, police confirmed at least 30 fatalities. But they added that many bodies remained inside the tower. The conditions made recovery difficult. Floors were unstable. Temperatures had been so high that identification would take time. Weeks, maybe months. For families, the wait was unbearable. Outside Grenfell, posters now covered entire walls. Faces, names, ages. Some signs simply read, "Still missing." In the days that followed, Queen Elizabeth II visited a nearby community center. She spoke to volunteers and survivors. Her presence was quiet but acknowledged. For many, it felt like the first gesture of dignity from someone in power. The government, under pressure, announced an emergency relief fund. Survivors would receive immediate financial assistance. But the damage, emotional, physical, and political, had already taken root. For the people of Grenfell, the questions weren't going away. How did this happen? Why weren't we protected? And why is it always people like us, the poor, the working class, the immigrant families, who pay the price? The fire was out, but the reckoning had only begun. By the end of June 2017, the blackened remains of Grenfell Tower still stood over North Kensington, silent and imposing. It had become more than a burned-out structure. It was now a symbol of loss, of neglect, and of failure. But it was also a crime scene. The Metropolitan Police launched a criminal investigation just days after the fire. They described it as the largest and most complex in the history of the London Fire Brigade. Detectives collected tens of thousands of documents. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They began the slow, meticulous task of trying to uncover exactly what went wrong and who was responsible. In parallel, the government launched a public inquiry, led by retired Judge Sir Martin Morbick. The aim was to investigate the circumstances of the fire, how it started, how it spread, and what decisions, political, technical, and administrative, had led to so many deaths. From the start, the inquiry was met with skepticism. Survivors and community leaders worried it would be a whitewash. Many felt they had been ignored for years. Now they feared the same institutions that failed them would control the narrative. There were calls for the panel to reflect the diversity of the community, for the scope of the inquiry to include not just the fire, but the housing policies that shaped Grenfell itself. Still, the inquiry began its first phase in September 2017, just 3 months after the fire. Its initial focus was narrow, the fire itself. How it began, how it spread, what emergency services did and didn't do. Witnesses were called. Evidence was shown. Technical reports were introduced. What emerged was devastating. The fire had started in a fridge freezer in Flat 16, just as initially believed. But the appliance alone was not the cause of the disaster. The key factor was the building's external cladding, aluminum composite panels backed with highly flammable polyethylene. When the fire breached the window of Flat 16, it ignited the cladding. The flames then spread rapidly up the building's exterior, far faster than they ever could have inside. The tower had been wrapped in what was, effectively, a flammable skin. Worse, the insulation behind the panels, made of polyisocyanurate foam, burned fiercely, releasing toxic smoke. The combination created a perfect storm: vertical fire spread, intense heat, and thick black smoke. The inquiry also revealed that the cladding system had failed every fire test conducted after the fire. In fact, according to expert analysis presented at the hearings, it should never have been installed on a residential high-rise. Attention quickly turned to the 2014 to 2016 refurbishment. The work had been commissioned by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, with day-to-day management by KCTMO. The principal contractor was Ryden Maintenance Ltd, and the cladding supplier was Arconic, a U.S. company whose panels had already been linked to fire safety issues in other countries. Documents showed that early designs for the refurbishment had included fire-resistant materials. But cost-cutting measures led to cheaper alternatives, including the flammable cladding. Internal emails revealed that decisions were made based on price, not safety. One quote stood out. In an internal Ryden email, an employee wrote, "We need good costs on the cladding. We are under pressure to come in low." That decision saved a few £1,000s. It cost 72 lives. Other failures came to light. There had been no full building fire alarm system. No sprinklers. The fire doors were not properly tested or maintained. Smoke ventilation systems failed during the fire. The single staircase had become a death trap. And the stay-put policy? It had remained in place for nearly 2 hours after it was clear the fire was out of control. That decision, according to multiple experts, cost lives. By the time residents were told to evacuate, many had no way out. The London Fire Brigade defended its crews. They had done everything they could under extraordinary circumstances. Many had risked their lives and saved dozens. But the inquiry found that institutional assumptions and outdated procedures had delayed a full evacuation. Commissioner Danny Cotton, the head of the brigade at the time, testified in November 2018. She stood by her officers, but faced criticism for her refusal to acknowledge systemic failings. Her comments, particularly that she wouldn't change anything, caused outrage. Survivors said it showed a lack of humility, a refusal to listen and learn. In the meantime, the criminal investigation continued in the background. Police confirmed they were considering charges including gross negligence manslaughter, corporate manslaughter, and breach of health and safety laws. They seized millions of documents, from council records to internal emails between contractors. But no one had yet been arrested. The survivors wanted more than answers. They wanted accountability. They had watched their neighbors die. They had lost entire families. They had lived in a building they were told was safe, only to find it wrapped in materials that burned like gasoline. And now they were being told the investigation would take years. Frustration grew. The community was still displaced. Hundreds of survivors had been placed in temporary accommodation, some still in hotels. Promises made by politicians had not been fulfilled. Trust was gone. But the inquiry did something else, too. It gave the victims a voice. Each hearing began with a tribute. Families were invited to speak. They shared memories of sons, daughters, grandmothers, husbands. They told stories of kindness, of ambition, of joy. Some brought photos. Others brought tears. They were quiet, personal, and undeniable. It reminded the country and the world that the 72 people who died were not statistics. They were loved, and they had been failed. By 2018, a year after the Grenfell fire, the questions had multiplied, and none had been fully answered. 72 people were dead. Hundreds more were displaced. The tower itself was still standing, wrapped now in white sheeting as forensic teams continued to work inside. But beyond the burned structure, the true scope of Grenfell's legacy was just beginning to unfold. The tragedy had exposed something bigger. The same dangerous cladding, or similar versions of it, had been installed on hundreds of buildings across the United Kingdom. Schools, hospitals, office blocks. Most troubling of all, other residential high-rises, including those housing thousands of people. In some cases, the buildings had been approved with minimal scrutiny. Fire safety certifications were often based on flawed testing methods or loopholes that allowed manufacturers to avoid full-scale fire performance assessments. What happened at Grenfell wasn't a one-time failure. It was systemic. The government launched a nationwide building safety review. Led by Dame Judith Hackett, the review focused on building regulations, enforcement, and fire safety practices. The final report, released in May 2018, did not call for an outright ban on flammable cladding, a decision that sparked outrage. The public wanted clear action. Survivors and campaigners wanted the materials banned. They wanted fire regulations overhauled. And they wanted to know why the buildings people called home had been treated like construction experiments. Eventually, the government did ban combustible cladding on new residential buildings over 18 meters. But the change applied only to future projects, not to the hundreds of towers already standing with similar materials. This created a new crisis. Thousands of residents were now living in homes labeled unsafe. Their buildings were wrapped in the same type of cladding that had turned Grenfell into an inferno. Many were told they would have to pay for the removal themselves, costs that ran into tens of thousands of pounds per flat. Mortgages were frozen. Property values collapsed. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. It became known as the cladding scandal, a second disaster born from the first. Meanwhile, the survivors of Grenfell were still waiting for justice. The public inquiry's first phase had laid bare the fire's physical causes. But accountability was still missing. No arrests had been made. No company had been prosecuted. No one from the council, the contractor, or the cladding manufacturer had been charged with a crime. The police continued their investigation, describing it as complex and ongoing. They said they were working closely with the inquiry and wouldn't bring charges until all evidence had been fully reviewed. But time dragged on. Grief gave way to anger. Protest banners reappeared across West London. Monthly silent walks through the streets became a ritual of remembrance, but also of resistance. People marched holding signs with the number 72 and the words "Forever in Our Hearts." At each gathering, survivors spoke. They told stories of promises broken, of therapy sessions that had to be fought for, of being moved from hotel to hotel, of neighbors still missing years later from the places where they should have been. The government faced growing pressure. In 2019, Prime Minister Theresa May left office. Her successor, Boris Johnson, visited the Grenfell site and promised that those responsible would be held to account. He repeated the pledge many times, but deadlines passed. Criminal prosecutions were pushed back again and again. Campaign groups like Grenfell United and Justice for Grenfell became more visible. They held demonstrations. They called out corporations by name. They published the names of politicians who had voted against stricter fire safety rules in the past. And still no charges. In 2020, the second phase of the inquiry began. It focused on the refurbishment and the roles of those involved: designers, contractors, manufacturers, and regulators. Emails and meeting minutes were shown. Many were damning. One contractor admitted he knew the cladding was flammable, but didn't speak up. A supplier said their product had failed fire tests, and that those results had been hidden. Executives from Arconic, the company that made the cladding, were called to testify. But key figures refused to attend in person, citing legal protections in their home countries. One internal document showed that Arconic had described the panels used at Grenfell as dangerous in a fire, years before they were sold to the project team. For the public, it felt like the truth was finally being spoken aloud. But still, no one was held criminally responsible. Meanwhile, the survivors endured a different kind of pain. They were not only fighting for justice, they were still grieving. Entire families had been lost. Grandparents, children, parents, wiped out in a single night. Some survivors had lost 5, 10, 12 members of their family. Others had lost every neighbor on their floor. The trauma didn't fade. For many, it deepened. Mental health services were stretched. Access to long-term care was inconsistent. Children who survived the fire had nightmares that returned year after year. Parents carried survivors' guilt that no therapy could erase. And as the national conversation moved on, the Grenfell community refused to let the story fade. They held vigils. They gave interviews. They kept the pressure alive, not just for their sake, but for everyone still living in unsafe buildings. They had been ignored once. They would not be ignored again. Years had passed since the night the sky over West London turned black. The tower itself no longer stood as it did in the days following the fire, its remains covered by scaffolding and wrapped in white protective sheeting, a shroud that was supposed to hide the horror but never truly could. The silhouette was still there. Everyone knew what lay behind it. Everyone still remembered who had been lost inside. The site became known as a living crime scene. No rebuilding took place. No demolition began. The structure remained untouched because the investigation had not yet concluded. It stood not only as a reminder of what had happened, but also as physical evidence, a towering statement of unfinished business. For the families of the victims, the waiting never really ended. While months turned to years, the promises made in the immediate aftermath remained mostly unmet. Politicians had spoken of justice, accountability, and reform, but little came quickly. Despite repeated public assurances, no criminal charges had been brought. There had been no arrests, no trials, and no verdicts. Survivors were told that the scope of the investigation demanded patience, that the scale and sensitivity of the case required careful handling. Yet, the delay itself became a source of renewed pain, not only because of the absence of justice, but because it served as a brutal reminder that the lives lost at Grenfell were still suspended in limbo. The public inquiry, though thorough in its process, moved slowly. The second phase, which focused on the refurbishment and the role of the companies involved, revealed an avalanche of failures. Internal communications between contractors and manufacturers painted a damning picture. One in which profit took precedence over safety, and in which critical decisions about materials and fire performance were made with eyes firmly fixed on cost margins, rather than human lives. Project managers had signed off on materials they knew were dangerous. Suppliers had failed fire safety tests, but continued to sell the products anyway. Some key figures had already left their posts or moved abroad, shielded by jurisdictional boundaries that made prosecution difficult. For the survivors and the families of those who had perished, the inquiry became a second arena of trauma. Sitting through the hearings, hearing the names of their loved ones read out during technical testimony, and watching corporate witnesses dodge responsibility under legal protection. It was a process many described as emotionally exhausting and, at times, dehumanizing. The families had asked for justice. What they often received instead was paperwork, delay, and bureaucratic indifference. Meanwhile, the broader public began to lose focus. As years passed and new crises filled the headlines, Grenfell faded from the front pages. But for the community that had once lived in and around the tower, it never moved to the background. For them, time didn't pass in the same way. The trauma was not something that could be compartmentalized or stored neatly away. It was felt daily, in flashbacks, in grief that remained unprocessed, in the visible scars of those who had barely made it out alive. Some of the survivors had been rehoused in new accommodations, but not always permanently or appropriately. A number were moved from hotel rooms to temporary flats that lacked proper heating, space, or stability. Others waited years to be offered a home that felt safe. For many, trust in local and national authorities had completely collapsed. They no longer believed in the systems designed to protect them, and with good reason. Those systems had failed in the most devastating way imaginable. The Grenfell disaster also sparked a wider reckoning with housing policy in the United Kingdom. For decades, social housing had been underfunded, neglected, and politically sidelined. Grenfell exposed what happens when corners are cut, regulations are diluted, and voices from the margins are ignored. It was no longer possible to pretend that housing inequality was a background issue. The fire made it visible in the most horrifying way. In the years that followed, the government promised sweeping reforms. Building safety laws were reviewed and updated. Combustible cladding was eventually banned on new high-rise residential buildings. A building safety regulator was created. But none of these changes moved fast enough for the thousands still living in unsafe buildings. Many leaseholders were trapped in homes they could not sell, faced with enormous bills for cladding removal and other safety upgrades. Some were forced to declare bankruptcy. Others simply stopped opening the letters. Campaign groups continued to push, not just for criminal accountability, but for systemic reform. Organizations like Grenfell United and Justice for Grenfell refused to allow the story to be reduced to a footnote. They held vigils, spoke in Parliament, and worked with other housing justice campaigns across the country. They made it clear that Grenfell was not a tragic anomaly. It was the result of political choices, negligence, and a culture of deregulation that valued cost over care. In a quiet corner of the city, on the side of a railway bridge just blocks from the tower, a mural reads, "Grenfell, forever in our hearts." The words are simple, but they say what no inquiry ever could. They speak to the dignity of the people who lived there, the value of the lives lost, and the determination of a community that refuses to be silenced. Grenfell was not just a fire, it was a rupture. It tore through not only a building, but through the illusion that all lives are treated equally in a modern, wealthy society. And years later, even as reports are written, panels conclude their hearings and officials make new announcements that central truth remains. The smoke may have cleared from the sky, but in the lives of those who carry its memory, it never really left. There was never a moment where everything began to feel normal again. For those who survived Grenfell, the idea of recovery was not something that followed a straight line. It wasn't just grief they were left with, it was displacement, trauma, anger, and a kind of silence that only made it harder to speak about what had really been lost. In the years that followed the fire, life for survivors became defined by contrast. On one side, there were the public hearings, the political statements, the televised memorials, symbolic gestures of justice still pending. On the other, there was the private reality of navigating daily life with a body that had been burned, lungs that still ached from smoke, or a heart that broke a little more every time a child asked why their sibling didn't make it out. Some survivors never returned to the neighborhood. They couldn't. The sound of helicopters overhead, the sight of tall buildings, even the smell of cooking oil could trigger flashbacks. For them, Grenfell wasn't just a memory. It was present, vivid and physical. It lived in their bodies, in their dreams, and in the gaps that had opened where loved ones used to be. Others chose to stay, not because it was easier, but because leaving felt like another kind of loss. They remained in West London not only to mourn, but to fight for their neighbors, for their families, and for the truth to be seen through to the end. They attended every vigil, walked in silence month after month, and built a network of mutual care that the system had failed to provide. Take, for instance, a father who escaped the 15th floor with his wife and 2 children. They had been asleep when the fire started. It was only when their youngest daughter began coughing uncontrollably that they realized something was wrong. By the time they opened the front door, the hallway was already thick with smoke. He carried both children down 20 flights, stopping on landings to catch his breath and listen for voices. They survived, but their home, everything they owned, was gone. In the weeks after, they lived in a single hotel room. The children couldn't sleep. His wife developed severe anxiety. He stopped working. Years later, they had moved to a new flat, but nothing about their lives had settled. The noise of a smoke alarm still sent their youngest into a panic. Or the woman from the 21st floor who lost her mother, her sister, and her niece that night. She had stepped outside briefly during the fire to call an ambulance for a neighbor and never made it back up. When the building was sealed, she had to accept that the last time she saw her family was through the closing doors of the lift. Since then, she had become an activist. She gave speeches, attended every inquiry hearing, and refused to let the public forget that her family had names, stories, dreams. The pain she carried didn't make her silent. It made her sharper, louder, but inside, the loss remained unmoved. One of the quietest tragedies of Grenfell was how children were forced to grow up in the aftermath. Some had lost siblings. Others had seen things that would follow them forever. Teachers in local schools described classrooms full of trauma, Children who flinched at loud noises, who cried when the fire alarm was tested, who sat staring out windows for entire lessons. They drew pictures of burning towers, of smoke, of their families standing at windows. The recovery was slow, and in many cases incomplete. And for those who weren't in the tower that night but lived close by, there was a different kind of burden. Many had heard the screams, seen the flames, watched as their friends vanished behind blackened glass. They carried survivors' guilt, the question of why it hadn't been them. Some wished they had done more. Others knew they had done everything they could. But guilt doesn't care about logic. It lingers. The support offered in the aftermath varied widely. Some survivors described social workers and housing officers who went above and beyond, who answered calls late at night, who helped secure therapy, who made sure birthdays and anniversaries were marked with dignity. But many others felt let down. Mental health services were underfunded and overstretched. The trauma was deep, but the follow-up was often surface level. It became common for people to be passed between agencies, forced to retell their stories over and over again. At times, it seemed the very systems meant to offer care were more focused on case management than healing. For the bereaved, milestones were no longer measured in time, but in memorials. The anniversary each June was a day of both remembrance and resistance. In churches, mosques, and schools, names were read out, candles were lit, and photographs were held in shaking hands. But each year that passed also made the silence around justice feel heavier. With no criminal charges filed, many began to wonder whether they would ever see someone held accountable. Justice became a word that felt less like a promise and more like a question. Yet, amidst everything, people built new kinds of strength. The Grenfell community didn't wait to be saved. They created networks, supported each other, and refused to be pushed aside. Women who had once been strangers began running community kitchens together. Fathers who had lost children set up mentorship programs for local teens. Survivors who had been isolated in grief found purpose in helping others navigate the system they themselves had been swallowed by. They weren't just rebuilding homes, they were rebuilding trust, one relationship at a time. But healing, if it came at all, was slow. There was no switch to flip, no moment when everything felt okay again. For many, the pain would always be there, not as a wound to be closed, but as a scar to be carried. In every flat that had once been filled with laughter, in every hallway where neighbors had once stood talking over cups of tea, there were stories that would never be fully told. And in every person who had made it out alive, there was the weight of knowing just how much had been lost in the flames. In the years since Grenfell, the tower itself has remained, physically and symbolically, at the center of a national reckoning. Its shell, now covered and silent, is still visible from trains pulling into Paddington, from the motorways that stretch west out of the city, and from the windows of council flats just across the estate. It stands not because it was preserved as a monument, but because its demolition had to wait for the completion of the investigations and criminal inquiries. In its stillness, it speaks louder than ever, not only about the fire, but about everything that made it possible. Grenfell changed the United Kingdom, but not in the tidy, redemptive way that people often expect from tragedy. There was no sweeping reform that suddenly fixed housing inequality. No revolution in fire safety that rendered every other tower safe. Instead, Grenfell became a mirror, reflecting, in devastating detail, what decades of political neglect, regulatory failure, and social stratification had produced. At first, the shock had been immediate and raw. Grenfell was described as a national catastrophe, a moment that cut across class and geography. For a time, it dominated public debate. Questions were asked in Parliament. Editorials filled national newspapers. Across the country, people began looking at their own buildings differently. But over time, as headlines shifted and attention dispersed, the people who had always lived with the consequences of neglect were once again left to carry the weight alone. Still, the fire had ruptured something that could not be easily repaired. It made visible a division long present in British life. The growing disconnect between those in positions of power and those whose lives are shaped by the consequences of policy. In Grenfell, people saw that safety was not equally distributed. That regulation could be influenced by profit. That warnings could go unheard, even when they were loud, clear, and repeated for years. For many, it crystallized a new understanding of inequality. This wasn't just about income. It was about dignity, about voice, about who gets listened to and who gets overlooked. Grenfell became a symbol not of a single failure, but of a layered systemic collapse, one that spanned housing, planning, accountability, and public trust. In the wake of the fire, activism in housing justice surged. Campaigns demanding safer social housing, greater tenant rights, and accountability for dangerous developments found new energy. Communities that had once felt ignored began organizing more visibly, inspired by the determination of those who had survived Grenfell and refused to be silenced. The disaster also forced a reassessment of how social housing was viewed in public life. For too long, council estates had been stigmatized, portrayed in policy and media as zones of dysfunction. But Grenfell recentered the humanity of those who lived in public housing. The people lost were not anonymous tenants. They were artists, teachers, drivers, students, grandparents, refugees. Their stories shifted the narrative. They were not problems to be solved. They were citizens who had been failed. Public memorials evolved into moments of national reflection. Silent walks through the streets of West London became a ritual of resistance. Not loud, not angry, but insistent. These walks, held monthly, passed the same paths once used by fire crews, by journalists, by mourners. With each step, they claimed space in a city that had once overlooked them. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence. It was a declaration: we are still here, and we remember. Education was affected too. Schools across London began including Grenfell in their curriculum, not only as a fire, but as a case study in ethics, responsibility, and the human cost of political decisions. Young people asked questions that many adults had stopped daring to voice. Why weren't they protected? Why did no one listen? Could this happen again? In local government, the fallout was significant. The Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, the body responsible for managing Grenfell Tower, was stripped of its responsibilities. Control over council housing in the borough was returned to the local authority. Public scrutiny of other TMOs increased. Trust, however, had already eroded too deeply for these changes to satisfy the community. In Parliament, MPs across parties cited Grenfell in debates on fire safety, cladding regulations, and tenant rights. It was invoked not as an abstract lesson, but as a visceral reminder of what's at stake when policies are written without human cost in mind. It became harder, though not impossible, to pass housing legislation without acknowledging the shadow Grenfell cast. The inquiry also reshaped how official negligence is discussed in Britain. It introduced a language of structural injustice into mainstream debate. It forced professionals, architects, engineers, council officers, to examine their role not only in terms of duty, but in terms of consequence. It reminded industries that public safety is not just a technical challenge, it's a moral one. And yet, the sense of unresolved justice has never gone away. The lack of criminal prosecutions, the slow pace of reform, and the persistent inequalities in housing continue to haunt the public response. Grenfell did not become a neat narrative of redemption. It became a long, painful record of what happens when warnings are ignored, when residents are treated as liabilities rather than human beings, and when accountability remains a distant promise. For those who lived through it, the legacy of Grenfell is not just measured in policy change or architectural redesigns. It is measured in the birthdays missed, in the rooms that remain empty, in the scars, both seen and unseen, carried by survivors, families, and the wider community. And yet, amidst the grief, something else remains. A refusal to let the story end with silence. A determination to speak not just for the dead, but for the living. To demand not just remembrance, but justice. To insist that housing is not a privilege, but a right, and that safety, dignity, and accountability must never again be decided by balance sheets. There is no full ending to what happened at Grenfell. There is no moment where the fire stops burning, not really. It may no longer rage in the night sky or send smoke into the clouds, but for those who lived through it, it never left. It lingers, not just as a memory, but as an everyday presence, woven into the streets, the families, the quiet spaces where someone's absence still feels louder than words. The tower no longer stands exposed, but it is still there. Covered now in white, it looms behind barriers and scaffolding, an absence disguised as a structure. There are no lights in its windows. No voices echo in the stairwells. But the names of those who once lived there are spoken every month in the streets below, during the silent walks, and in the homes that still bear photos and memories of a life that was supposed to go on. Inside West London, the Grenfell community still exists, not defined by tragedy but by persistence, by the neighbors who continue to support one another, by the survivors who turned grief into advocacy, by the families who wake up every day carrying more than most will ever see, and still keep going. Some have rebuilt parts of their lives. Others remain in limbo. Children who were rescued from the tower are growing up, slowly shaping a future they didn't choose but are determined to live through. Parents who lost everything continue to attend every meeting, every vigil, every inquiry session. Not because it gives closure, but because it's what the dead deserve. Grenfell didn't break this community. It revealed its strength. It showed the world that people who had been pushed to the margins could hold the center when everything else collapsed. That they didn't need permission to grieve with dignity. That they could speak for themselves, and that when they did, the truth would be impossible to ignore. And while institutions have shifted, even reformed on paper, the community still waits for justice that is meaningful, not symbolic. They know that memorials matter, but not more than accountability. That public compassion is important, but not more than action. They've seen the promises. What they want now is change that lasts. Many survivors say the only justice that could ever match the scale of the loss would be for no one else to ever experience what they did. That no other parent should carry a child down a burning stairwell. That no other teenager should wake to the sound of screaming through the walls. That no one else should have to call for help from a window, knowing no one can reach them in time. In the years since the fire, Grenfell has become more than a headline or a case study. It has become a line in the national conscience, a reference point, a warning, and a demand. It reminds people that fire safety isn't a technical detail. It's a matter of life and death. That housing policy isn't abstract. It's personal. That residents are not obstacles. They are experts in their own lives, and their voices must matter. There is now a firm understanding in the public. Grenfell was not an accident. It was a consequence of choices made, warnings ignored, corners cut, and lives undervalued. Still, the people who carry its legacy refuse to be defined by only what was taken. They hold on to what remains: the names, the memories, the voices, the laughter that once filled those floors. In every home that was lost, there was a story. In every room, there was life. Grenfell Tower may one day be taken down, brick by brick, its steel and concrete carried away. But what happened there, and who was lost, will not vanish. It is in the songs sung at memorials. It's in the hands held during the silent walks. It's in the murals painted on brick walls. It's in the conversations that still begin with, "Do you remember?" It is in the fight for safe housing, for real accountability, for the dignity of all people. Not just those born into safety, but everyone. And maybe that is where this story ends. Not in closure, not in resolution, but in remembrance, and in the ongoing, ordinary, necessary work of making sure it never happens again.